3, 2, 1. That was the moment he should have pulled the trigger. Instead, his head exploded before anyone fired a single shot. No muzzle flash, no sound, no shooter. A little girl was supposed to die on camera that day, but someone watching from far beyond the perimeter refused to let that happen. The bullet came from nowhere. The path was blocked, and yet somehow it landed 3 seconds before the target even moved. Who took the shot? How did they know? Let's check in. 1 if it's your first time, 2 if you've watched a few, 3 if you never miss. You're watching Veteran Biker, where real strength speaks without rank. Subscribe for more untold stories. Let's begin. The Red Valley Industrial Zone was a wound on the landscape, a sprawling monument to a life that had long since departed. Its metallic bones, the rust-eaten cranes and hulking silos, scraped against a bruised sky, a canvas of unending grey. The air was thick with the scent of decay and the cold promise of a coming storm. It was a place where stories ended, not began. 4 in the afternoon. The light was a flat, unforgiving grey that leached all colour from the world, turning every shadow into a consuming black. A relentless wind, cold and sharp as a scalpel, howled through the open corridors of an abandoned factory complex. This wasn't just a weather phenomenon, it was a character in the unfolding tragedy, a living, breathing obstacle designed to make an impossible situation even more so. High above the chaos, perched on the crumbling edge of a concrete silo, Nate Ryland saw it all through the magnified, unblinking eye of his scope. He was 38, a man whose hands were as steady as his gaze, but whose eyes held the ghost of a past mission failure, a weight he carried with every breath. He was a veteran sniper, a man who had faced down gods and monsters, but the scene unfolding below made a mockery of his experience, his skill, his very existence. Beside him, Rami Torres, his spotter, was a human calculator in a world of chaos. 32, brilliant, with a mind that saw the universe in numbers and angles. Rami was the logical anchor that kept Nate from being pulled under by the currents of his own history. Right now, Rami's mind was a whirlwind of variables: wind speed, humidity, atmospheric pressure, the impossible angles of a shot that Nate desperately needed to take, and the terrible certainty that such a shot was not possible. Their target was a man holding a little girl hostage in the center of the factory floor. The girl, no older than 8, was a tiny, trembling figure in a world of concrete and steel, her small body shaking with a terror that radiated even from this distance. Her mother lay still on the grey floor, a scarlet stain blooming across the concrete, a silent testament to the evil on display. Her father, bound and gagged, watched with eyes that were swollen shut from struggling and crying, a silent witness to a horror he was powerless to stop. Nate's crosshairs danced across the target's face. The man was a ghost Nate knew intimately. Viktor Rashenko, 40 years old, ex-Special Forces, Nate's former teammate, a man who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him, now a deranged extremist holding an innocent child's life in his hands. A 5-year-old classified mission, a failure that had haunted Nate's every waking moment, had just come roaring back to life, a spectre of betrayal and revenge. Nate. Rami's voice was a whisper, tight with a shock that was both professional and deeply personal. I've got a match. Facial recognition, ran it through back-channel military files. I thought I was seeing things, but it's him. Viktor Rashenko. The name hit Nate with the force of a bullet. They had been told Viktor was dead, that the classified op he had claimed another victim, but here he was, a living phantom, a monument to the lie they had all been sold. Nate's finger went rigid, resting on the trigger. The guilt, the grief, the white-hot anger of 5 years of carrying a phantom burden all came crashing down on him in a tidal wave of emotion. Below, Viktor Rashenko raised a phone to his face. The screen flickered to life, broadcasting a live feed to a world of onlookers. His eyes, manic and wild with a righteous fury, stared into the camera as if he could see every person watching. To the pigs watching this feed, to the politicians who betrayed us, you left me to die. You called me a loose end. Now I'll show you what a loose end can do. He pointed a handgun at the little girl's temple. A sob, faint and choked, escaped her lips, swallowed by the howling wind. The world for a moment held its breath. Victor began to count down, his voice slow and deliberate, a new form of psychological torture. 60, 59, 58. The factory floor was a labyrinth of steel beams, concrete pillars, and abandoned machinery. Each one was a potential obstacle, a random ricochet waiting to happen. The wind, a constant, unpredictable force, ripped through the broken windows and gaping holes in the roof, making any long-range shot a suicidal gamble. Nate's mind raced through the calculations, the variables, the angles. There was no clean shot. None. If he took it, the bullet could be deflected, hitting the girl or her father. If he missed, Victor would kill her anyway, his point proven and his vengeance secured. Rami's whispered updates were a constant stream of impossible numbers. Wind shear is at 9 meters per second, gusting to 15. The angle is 12.4 degrees, but the thermal fluctuations from the concrete floor are creating a refraction. The target is moving slightly, a micro shift every 4 seconds. It's an impossible shot, Nate. Nate knew it was impossible. His training, his instincts, his every muscle fiber screamed at him to find a way, but there was no way. The ghosts of the past whispered in his ear, a chorus of failure and regret. He remembered the last time he'd seen Victor, a flash of fire and a desperate shout that had been lost to the roar of a collapsing building. He had believed Victor was gone, a casualty of a classified operation gone wrong. He had lived with that belief for 5 years. But now here he was, a living nightmare, holding a little girl hostage, forcing Nate to confront the very failure he had been trying to forget. Victor's voice echoed through the cavernous space, each number a hammer blow to Nate's soul. 40, 39, 38. The countdown was a weapon, a psychological assault designed to break the will of anyone watching, a relentless march toward a terrible end. Nate's finger twitched on the trigger. He could feel the cold metal, the phantom weight of a choice he was not allowed to make. His mind flashed back to the last time he'd failed, the memory of a teammate lost, a life taken. He couldn't let that happen again. He wouldn't. But the variables were against him, the laws of physics a cruel joke. He tried to find a new angle, a new position. He scanned the factory floor for any signs of a weakness, a crack in Victor's defenses, anything he could use. But Victor was a trained operator. He had chosen his position with ruthless efficiency, using the hostages as a human shield and the factory's labyrinthine structure to his advantage. There was no flanking maneuver, no tactical advantage to be gained. They were trapped, forced to watch a tragedy unfold in slow motion. 21, 20, 19... Victor's voice was filled with a chilling glee, a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The little girl whispered something, a silent prayer that Nate couldn't hear. Her father's eyes, wide with a final, desperate terror, were fixed on his daughter. Nate's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against the relentless countdown. He was a sniper, a hero of countless battles, a man who had faced down terrorists and dictators and won. But here, in this abandoned factory, he was nothing more than a witness, a spectator to a tragedy that was unfolding right before his eyes, a life slipping away with every number Victor spoke. He was a man with a rifle 100 yards away, and he was completely, utterly powerless. 10, 9, 8... The world had shrunk to a single terrible moment. Nate's breathing was ragged, his hands slick with sweat. He was a professional, but no amount of training could prepare him for this. This wasn't a tactical problem, it was a moral one, a test of his resolve, of his humanity, of his capacity to act when all hope was lost. "3," Victor said, his voice a chilling hiss. The little girl's eyes squeezed shut, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. Her father's chest heaved with a silent, agonizing sob. Nate's finger twitched again, a silent prayer of its own. He knew this was it, the moment of no return, the moment when another life, another innocent would be lost, the moment he would carry for the rest of his life. He breathed in, ready to make a choice he knew was wrong, ready to pull the trigger and pray for a miracle that wouldn't come. But before he could, a new sound, a different kind of sound, filled the air. It wasn't the wind or the radio or the countdown. It was a sharp, percussive crack, the sound of something shattering. It was a sound that had no source, no origin, no explanation. It was a sound that shouldn't exist. Viktor Rashenko's head, in the space of a single, impossible heartbeat, erupted in a cloud of blood and bone. His body went limp, dropping instantly to the floor. The countdown was over. The silence that followed was deafening, a thick, heavy blanket of disbelief. Nate, his finger frozen on the trigger, stared into his scope. Victor was gone. But Nate hadn't fired. Rami hadn't fired. No one had... The little girl, now free, ran screaming into her father's arms. The world for a moment paused. It was a miracle, but one with no explanation, no source, no logic. It was a ghost of a shot no one saw, a shot no one took. And in that moment, Nate Ryland knew that his world had just been fundamentally and irrevocably changed. The vacuum of silence that followed the impossible shot was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on Nate Ryland and Rami Torres. The roar of the wind, the panicked shouts of the hostages, the countdown, all had been replaced by a quiet so profound it felt like the world had simply stopped. On the factory floor below, Viktor Rashenko's body was a motionless heap, a grotesque, broken thing. The little girl, her screams now a desperate, choked sob, was a flash of movement, a single bright star of life in a universe of sudden, unearned death as she scrambled into her father's arms. Her father, still bound, held her to him, his hands clumsy but his grip fierce, his face a contorted mask of disbelief and an overwhelming liquid grief. Nate's finger, still frozen on the trigger, felt like it no longer belonged to him. His mind, a finely tuned machine built for threat assessment and lethal precision, was a cacophony of white noise. The crosshairs of his scope were a static, unmoving crucifix over the body of a man who was, by all logical accounts, supposed to be his kill. But Nate hadn't fired. The absence of recoil, the lack of the thunderous report from his .338 Lapua Magnum was as deafening as a gunshot itself. Beside him, Rami Torres, the man who saw the world in pure cold numbers, was utterly silent. Rami's eyes, glued to his own spotting scope, were wide with a kind of awe that bordered on sheer terror. He was scanning, his head moving in slow, methodical sweeps, his trained gaze searching every inch of the factory floor, every rooftop, every shattered window in a 5-kilometer radius. But there was nothing, not a flicker of light, not a wisp of smoke, not a shadow of movement. It was as if the bullet had materialized from thin air, a physical impossibility that shattered the very foundation of their profession. I didn't see it, Rami whispered, his voice a disbelieving gasp. Nate, I didn't see a thing. No muzzle flash, no glint of light, nothing, not even a flicker. The bullet path was clear as day. The target was there, and then he wasn't. There's There's no rational explanation. The words were a cold shard of ice piercing the fog in Nate's mind. He pulled his eye from the scope, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The silence was broken by the distant wail of sirens, the sound of the official world rushing to catch up to a reality it couldn't possibly comprehend. Far below, the factory had erupted into movement, but not violence. The impossible climax of the standoff had ended with a life saved, not taken. The young girl, just moments ago a trembling target in the crosshairs, was now clinging to her father, her sobs muffled against his chest. A tactical team swept in around them, executing the post-breach protocol with mechanical precision. Their faces betrayed more than discipline. They were reeling, caught between confusion and unexpected relief. They didn't know what Nate and Rummy now understood. They hadn't seen the shot. They hadn't seen the ghost. All they knew was that it had worked. Nate's earpiece crackled, then exploded with static and shouted queries. Command had finally broken the radio silence. Overwatch 1, do you copy? Report status immediately. Who took the shot? Confirm impact. Confirm shooter. Repeat, who fired? Nate's fingers curled around the radio, his grip tightening so hard his knuckles turned bone white. He glanced sideways at Rami, who only returned a helpless shake of the head. His laptop still glowed with active calculations, but the numbers had stopped making sense minutes ago. This wasn't math anymore. It was something else. Nate pressed the radio button, his voice rough with disbelief. "This is Overwatch 1, he said. We did not fire. I repeat, we did not take the shot. Target is down. Hostages are safe. But the shot wasn't ours." The other end of the line fell dead silent. A silence that meant only one thing. Command didn't know what to do with that answer. The very structure of their system, protocol, hierarchy, authorization, could not account for what Nate had just said. Because Nate and Rami had the only authorized rifles, the only vantage, the only line of fire, and they had just admitted they had done nothing. Then the radio erupted again, louder this time, harsher. Questions piled over each other. What was the angle? Where was the shooter? Can we get a satellite feed? Is the sniper on the roof? Is it an inside job? But Nate had nothing to give. No angle, no witness, no trajectory, no explanation. Just one impossible truth: someone else had taken the shot. The world had seen the result. The terrorist collapsing backward in a spray of red. The girl rescued, the room cleared, but nobody, no drone, no camera, no thermal scope, had captured the moment the bullet flew. There was no muzzle flash, no telltale movement, just a vanishing point and a miracle. Except Nate Ryland didn't believe in miracles. He believed in velocity, air resistance, gravity, drag coefficients. He believed in scope zeroing, trigger discipline, and kinetic energy. And what had just happened defied every one of those principles. He wasn't watching a miracle, he was watching a violation of physics. As the emergency responders flooded the factory below, FBI, SWAT, field medics, bomb disposal, the Overwatch perch remained untouched. Nate and Rami stood still, stone figures high above a city that had just witnessed something it couldn't name. Below them, agents were already sweeping for evidence: broken glass, shell fragments, footprint impressions. But there was nothing. No casing, no weapon, no sniper's nest. The search had begun, but they didn't even know what they were searching for. Behind Nate, the only sound was the clack of Rami's fingers dancing across the keyboard until they stopped. Abruptly, Nate turned. Rami was staring at the screen, frozen, his eyes wide, but not with fear, with understanding. "I ran it again," Rami murmured, voice low, almost reverent, factored in the pressure shifts per meter, traced the thermal drift off the rooftop exhaust, calibrated the air turbulence at every altitude. I even adjusted for the Coriolis effect. Earth's rotation, Nate. Nate said nothing. He couldn't. Rami looked up, eyes burning with a realization that bordered on awe. "Someone didn't just take a shot," he whispered. They solved every variable. They knew everything. The shot was designed. And suddenly Nate knew that this wasn't random, this wasn't luck. Someone, something had seen what was coming long before it happened. A ghost, a phantom with a rifle, and they had fired from beyond the limits of logic. Nate, "I've got it," he said, his voice a barely there whisper, filled with a mix of dread and awe. "The bullet path. It's straight, a perfect, uninterrupted trajectory. But the point of origin, it must have come from over 2.3 kilometers away. That's a mile and a half. The target was moving slightly, and the wind was a nightmare. This isn't just a great shot, Nate. This is beyond human capability. This is a ghost shot." Nate's mind, which had been trying to process the impossibility of the moment, latched onto Rami's words. 2.3 kilometers. That was a distance reserved for the legends, for the 1 in a million shots taken in perfect conditions. This was not perfect. This was a chaotic, windswept, industrial nightmare. A needle through a keyhole from a mile away. "And that's not all," Rami continued, his fingers now flying across the keyboard with a newfound manic energy. The shot had to thread through a 6-inch concrete gap, an opening in a wall, a single, perfectly timed window of opportunity that existed for maybe a half second. It's like throwing a needle through a keyhole from a mile and a half away. And it didn't ricochet. There's no damage, no spalling. Just a clean, single point of impact. The physics don't work. The words seem to linger, suspended in the air like smoke, bearing witness to a level of precision that defied every known metric. This shot didn't simply violate the laws of physics. It dismantled the very logistics that governed real-world marksmanship. It hadn't just demanded exceptional talent, it required a depth of environmental mastery so complete, so thoroughly attuned, that it bordered on clairvoyance. Whoever had taken that shot didn't merely account for shifting conditions, they seemed to have predicted them, as though they had. Seen the wind before it moved, understood pressure differentials before they existed, and acted in perfect concert with a world in flux. Then came the update from the tactical teams sweeping the site. A brief crackle over the radio. A discovery, not a weapon, not a figure on the run, but something just as telling, a military-grade atmospheric sensor hidden from plain sight. The device had been stashed deep within the old crane's skeletal frame, far above ground level, an area overlooked in the initial sweep. It was still active, still collecting. A quiet, mechanical witness to a plan executed with chilling forethought. Every fluctuation in wind, every temperature dip, every shift in barometric pressure, it had been logged, mapped, and likely modeled before the shot was ever taken. Rami, who had been rerunning numbers in a near-manic loop, looked up from his data stream with wide eyes. His voice, normally confident and analytical, now trembled with realization. "This wasn't chance," he said softly. "This wasn't luck, or instinct, or adrenaline. They managed the chaos. They accounted for everything. They weren't waiting for an opportunity. They engineered one. They controlled the air itself. Nate, this wasn't a rescue. It was a precision strike, calculated to the millisecond." Nate felt a chill crawl up his spine, not from the cold wind, but from the memory it stirred. Victor's face rose in his mind, those wild, burning eyes full of fury and conviction, the kind that belonged to a man who no longer feared death, but had already embraced it. And then, deeper still, came a memory Nate hadn't summoned in years. A moment buried beneath trauma and bureaucracy from a time long before everything fell apart. He had been cleaning his rifle beside Victor, the two of them bone-tired after a mission that had nearly gone sideways. Victor had said something then, barely above a whisper. Only the ones who disappear can ever really kill without being seen. Nate hadn't thought much of it then. Just one of many strange things men say after close calls. But now, with the silence of the shot still ringing in his ears, and a ghost sniper somewhere out there rewriting the rules, those words had returned, vivid and heavy with meaning. This wasn't just about a shot. It was about the kind of person who could take it and remain invisible. Following a new clue embedded in the sensor's data log, the tactical team redirected their search. They ascended to a rooftop nearly a block away, one few had considered relevant during the initial chaos. There, perched high above the city, was a rusted crane cab, long thought abandoned, untouched by time. But now it told a different story. Small signs of recent disturbance dotted the space. A partial fingerprint smudged into an edge of steel. The faint rub of a boot sole across dusty flooring. A nearly imperceptible dent on the inside of the windowsill. No tools, no shell casings, no rifle. But still, unmistakable, someone had been here. There was no scent of powder, no brass, no heat residue. The wind had done its work, scouring away all trace. And yet, the scene felt staged, just enough evidence left behind, as if by design. As if the shooter hadn't simply disappeared, but had wanted to leave behind the faintest of echoes. A trail not for law enforcement, but for someone specific. For Nate, a trail of whispers and shadows, a trail left by someone who didn't run, but vanished. They found no shooter, no rifle, no footprints leading away from the scene, just silence. And a single final clue. As the sun, now a bruised orange, began to set, the tactical team discovered a small, almost imperceptible reflection on the crane glass. A reflection that had only been there for a fraction of a second, just after the shot. It was a signal, a message, a final taunting wink from the killer to the world. A message that said, "I was here." Nate looked at Rami, and for the first time in his life, the human calculator had no numbers to offer. The logic was gone. The numbers had been replaced by a ghost, a perfect, impossible shot that had come from nowhere and left nothing behind. And Nate Ryland, a man who had lived his life by the rules, a man whose entire existence was defined by logic and precision, was suddenly staring into a world where neither of those things seemed to matter anymore. The hunt was on, not for a terrorist, but for the ghost who had ended him. The air in the command center was a thick, buzzing miasma of confusion and frantic energy. The impossible shot at Red Valley Industrial Zone had shattered not just a terrorist's skull, but the very foundations of their operational logic. The event, now a national headline, was being dissected by every news outlet, every armchair expert, and every intelligence analyst in the country. Nate Ryland and Rami Torres were at the heart of it all, two men whose professional lives were defined by precision and certainty, now wrestling with an event that was the very antithesis of both. The official report was a blank page where the shooter's name should have been, a testament to a truth they couldn't admit to the public. They had no idea what had happened. The days that followed blurred into a relentless cycle of restless nights and endless meetings. The FBI and SWAT teams had conducted a thorough, painstaking sweep of the factory, but their investigation yielded nothing that could explain the inexplicable. They were a hammer looking for a nail, but the nail had vanished into thin air. Dr. Lena Brooks, a calm, methodical FBI ballistics specialist in her 40s, was brought in to lead the forensic analysis. Her quiet, confident demeanor was a stark contrast to the growing panic and frustration in the room. Her job, a role she had performed flawlessly for years, was to provide a technical confirmation, to turn a bullet's journey into a scientific narrative. But this time the bullet's narrative defied science. Dr. Brooks's initial report was as baffling as Nate's own testimony. The bullet, a high caliber, 338 Lapua Magnum, had entered Viktor Rishenko's skull with a clean, straight path. There was no evidence of ricochet, no secondary impact points. It was a perfect single point of entry, a testament to a marksmanship that should not exist. The trajectory analysis, even with the data from the recovered wind device, pointed to a point of origin so distant and so obstructed that it was, by all conventional standards, an impossible shot. The only thing she could confirm was that the bullet was indeed a real physical object. The rest of its story was pure fantasy. The bullet's journey, according to every known law of physics, should have ended against a concrete wall, not in the terrorist's head. Rami, haunted by the numbers that made no sense, became a ghost in the command center. He moved with a furious, restless energy, a blur of motion and frantic typing on his workstation. He had taken the data from the wind measurement device and plugged it into every simulation he could find, running the variables over and over again. The device, a sophisticated piece of military-grade sensor equipment, had captured minute changes in air pressure, temperature, and wind speed at the point of impact. It was irrefutable proof that the shooter had not only planned the shot, but had an intimate, real-time understanding of the environmental conditions at the very moment of impact. It was the sniper equivalent of having an inside man, a perfect, undetectable accomplice in the wind itself. The major twist came from a tactical team that had been dispatched to a seemingly random, forgotten detail in the initial sweep. They had gone back to the old, abandoned crane cab that had shown signs of recent use, a cold trail that had initially been dismissed as a dead end. This time they didn't just look for fingerprints or scuff marks, they looked for purpose. And they found it. Tucked away inside the rusted metal frame, hidden behind a loose panel, was a small military-grade computer terminal. It was old, a relic from a forgotten era, but its memory logs were a treasure trove of information. The terminal, they discovered, had been used to remotely control the wind measurement device. The shooter hadn't just used the wind, they had, in a sense, owned it, a master puppeteer pulling the strings of an invisible force. Nate's instincts, a gut feeling honed by years of hunting men and surviving impossible odds, flared to life. He recalled Victor once saying, "Only the ones who disappear can ever really kill without being seen." The memory had been a fleeting thought in the chaos of the standoff, a quiet echo from a distant past. But now it resonated with a terrible clarity. Victor wasn't just a rogue extremist, he was a former teammate, part of the same classified op that had ruined Nate's life. He would have known the lingo, the philosophy, the quiet, unspoken rules of their world. The person who took the shot wasn't just a sniper, they were a ghost from the same past, a phantom who had mastered the art of being invisible. The shooter wasn't a hero, they were a hunter, and they were playing a game with rules that no one else understood. The computer logs from the crane terminal pointed to a single cryptic string of coordinates, a dead drop of information sent in the seconds after the shot was fired. It was a final, taunting signature. When Rami, with his savant-like ability to see patterns in chaos, decoded the string, it pointed to a warehouse 15 miles away. The address was a paradox. A shot from a mile and a half away was impossible. A clue pointing to a location 15 miles away was madness. The logistics were a cruel joke, a taunt from a brilliant mind that was playing a game on a level no one else could comprehend. The ghost wasn't just killing, the ghost was communicating. A small elite team with Nate and Rami at the lead was dispatched to the warehouse. They moved with a quiet, focused urgency, the air of institutional confusion replaced by the cold, hard certainty of a chase. The game had just changed. They were no longer looking for a shooter, they were looking for a ghost. The hunt had begun, and the ghost had left them a trail of breadcrumbs, each one more unbelievable than the last. The warehouse was a cavernous, empty space filled with the dust and silence of a long-dead industry. There was no one there. No sign of a struggle, no evidence of a recent presence. The ghost was gone. But they had left a calling card. In the center of the concrete floor, a single, still warm, 338 Lapua Magnum casing lay in a perfect, solitary circle. It was a stark, almost theatrical piece of evidence. Nate's heart pounded in his chest. A casing, the most intimate, personal signature of a sniper. But this casing, when he picked it up, felt alien. It was a perfect, pristine thing, a metallic testament to a shot that was both real and impossible. On the floor, burned into the concrete with a corrosive acid, were 3 words, "When no one else can, I still can." The message was a gauntlet, a challenge thrown down to a system that had failed. It was a declaration of a different kind of justice, a justice that operated in the shadows, outside the jurisdiction of law and order. Dr. Brooks, a ghost of her former self, was given the casing. She ran the ballistics, the chemical analysis, the microscopic scans. Her face, usually a picture of calm confidence, was now a mask of profound disbelief. The casing, she reported, was a ballistic nightmare. It had no serial number, no markings, no unique imperfections that could be traced back to a specific rifle. It was a perfect blank slate, a bullet without a history. It was impossible to trace. It was a ghost. Dr. Michael Chun, a male in his 52nd and a physics consultant for the FBI, a man whose entire worldview was built on the cold, hard logic of the universe, was brought in to run the simulations. He was a skeptical, scientific man to a fault, a man who believed in nothing he couldn't prove. But the case of the ghost shot was breaking his mind. Dr. Chun ran the simulations 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, 1,000,000,000 times. He factored in the wind data, the trajectory, the point of origin, the obstacles. He built a digital replica of the factory, a perfect virtual world where every variable was accounted for. And every single time the simulation ended with the same result, the shot was impossible. The bullet path was a straight line, clean and unwavering, but according to every known law of physics, it should have been blocked by multiple concrete layers. The bullet should have hit a wall, disintegrated, ricocheted, or simply stopped, but it hadn't. It had gone clean through, a ghost bullet in a world of physical laws. Nate remained obsessed. He kept the casing. It never went into evidence. He slipped it into his pocket, a cold, metallic weight that served as a physical reminder of the ghost, a tactile link to a truth that no one else believed. It was his proof that he wasn't crazy, that he hadn't hallucinated the shot. It was a single solitary piece of evidence that his world, a world of rules and regulations and logic, was a lie. The ghost was real, and the ghost was out there. The hunt was no longer a professional duty, it was a personal obsession. The warehouse was a cathedral of silence and decay, its cavernous interior filled with the dust of forgotten years. The air was cold, a ghost of the winter that had long since passed, and every sound, the scrape of a boot on the concrete, the quiet clicking of Nate Ryland's radio, echoed with a hollow finality. The ghost was gone, but it had left its calling card, a physical testament to its existence and its message. In the center of the concrete floor, a single, still warm, 338 Lapua Magnum casing lay in a perfect solitary circle. It was a stark, almost theatrical piece of evidence, a gauntlet thrown down to a world that believed in a different kind of justice. Nate knelt, his gloved hand hovering over it. The cold metallic gleam of the casing a physical testament to a shot that was both real and impossible. On the floor, burned into the concrete with a corrosive acid, were 3 words, "When no one else can, I still can." The message was a declaration of a different kind of justice, a justice that operated in the shadows, outside the jurisdiction of law and order. Nate's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against the relentless silence. He was a man of cold, hard facts, a man who had built his life on evidence and logic, but here, in this empty warehouse, all his logic was a lie. The casing, the message, the coordinates from the crane cab, it all pointed to a single inescapable conclusion. A ghost was playing a game with them. Dr. Lena Brooks, the FBI ballistics specialist, arrived an hour later, her face a mask of professional curiosity that couldn't quite hide a creeping bewilderment. She meticulously documented the scene, photographing the casing and the acid-burned words, her quiet, methodical movements a stark contrast to the growing frenzy in the room. This wasn't just a crime scene, it was a philosophical battlefield. "This is a message, Nate," she said, her voice low and grave, a very personal one. "They want us to know they were here, and they want us to know we can't catch them." Nate didn't respond. He had already come to that conclusion. The hunt was no longer a professional duty, it was a personal obsession. He kept the casing. It was a cold, metallic weight in his pocket, a physical reminder of the ghost, a tactile link to a truth that no one else believed. It was his proof that he wasn't crazy, that he hadn't hallucinated the shot. It was a single solitary piece of evidence that his world, a world of rules and regulations and logic, was a lie. Dr. Brooks took the casing back to the lab, where she ran a battery of tests that defied conventional forensic science. The casing, she reported back to the command center, was a ballistic nightmare. It had no serial number, no unique markings, no microscopic imperfections that could be traced back to a specific rifle. It was a perfect blank slate, a bullet without a history. It was impossible to trace. It was a ghost. Meanwhile, Dr. Michael Chun, a skeptical and scientific physics consultant, a man whose entire worldview was built on the cold, hard logic of the universe, was brought in to run the simulations. He was a man who believed in nothing he couldn't prove, and the case of the ghost shot was breaking his mind. Dr. Chun ran the simulations 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, 1,000,000,000 times. He factored in the wind data, the trajectory, the point of origin, the obstacles. He built a digital replica of the factory. A perfect virtual world where every variable was accounted for, and every single time the simulation ended with the same result. The shot was impossible. The bullet path was a straight line, clean and unwavering, but according to every known law of physics, it should have been blocked by multiple concrete layers. The bullet should have hit a wall, disintegrated, ricocheted, or simply stopped, but it hadn't. It had gone clean through, a ghost bullet in a world of physical laws. Nate watched Dr. Chun, a man of pure intellect, slowly unraveling. He saw the same doubt, the same bewilderment, the same quiet terror that he and Rami had felt on that silo. The ghost wasn't just a shooter, it was a force of nature, a living paradox that was shattering the very fabric of their reality. The casing, the untraceable bullet, the impossible shot, it all pointed to a level of operational security and technical expertise that was beyond anything the FBI had ever encountered. The ghost wasn't just a former sniper. They were a master of their craft, a living weapon that had transcended the limitations of the physical world. Nate's obsession grew. He spent his days and nights poring over the case files, looking for a lead that didn't exist. He reread Victor's file, looking for a connection, a clue, a whisper of a ghost. The file was a sterile, sanitized document, a testament to a life that had been erased from the official record, but buried within the pages, a single fleeting detail caught Nate's eye. A woman, a former elite sniper discharged for insubordination. Anya Dracoff, mid-30s, a ghost-like presence, Her file was just as clean as Victor's, a professional disappearance, a ghost who had walked away from the world. Rami, ever the loyal partner, was working a different angle. He was a brilliant hacker, and he had been trying to trace the digital breadcrumbs left by the ghost. He had found a series of encrypted messages, a digital conversation between the wind measurement device and the crane terminal. The messages were a series of complex mathematical equations, a language that only a handful of people in the world could understand. Rami, with his savant-like ability, was one of them. He was slowly, painstakingly translating the ghost's message. The messages defied easy interpretation. They were, in their essence, a contradiction. On the surface, they appeared to be composed of raw, quantifiable data, wind vectors, elevation angles, environmental pressure shifts. But beneath that layer of analytical precision was something far more intimate. These weren't merely notes about physics or ballistics. They carried a pulse, a cadence, as if the shooter had encoded not just information but intent. The data felt strangely emotional, rooted not just in tactical awareness, but in something instinctual. They spoke of rhythm, of atmosphere, of the subtle nuances that only a seasoned sniper could perceive. The weight of the air moments before a shot, the way silence deepens just before a trigger is pulled. This wasn't just execution, this was expression. The individual behind the shot hadn't just calculated, it was as though they had felt the shot into existence. Nate's stomach tightened. That sensation, he knew it. He had lived it. Countless times, in the field, lying still for hours with a heartbeat synced to his scope, he had felt that moment when logic gives way to instinct. When something unexplainable guides your breath, your squeeze, your timing. He had always believed that was his edge. But now, as he reviewed the ghost's trail, he realized he was staring at a form of mastery that operated on an even higher frequency. Where he had trusted intuition, the ghost had weaponized it, had turned chaos into control. What had begun as a procedural investigation, something detached and professional, had now transformed into something far more intimate. This wasn't just about a shooter anymore. For Nate, it had become a pursuit of something other. He wasn't following a suspect. He was following a shadow, one that moved just ahead of him, always out of reach, always whispering in codes only he could begin to understand. This ghost, whoever they were, was not just a figure from the present. There was a thread connecting them to Nate's own past. They had done what Nate had failed to do. Saved a life, executed a shot that Nate himself had calculated was impossible, and then, as if to drive the point home, they had left behind a casing, flawless, deliberately placed. It wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a message, a mirror held up to Nate's own uncertainty, a quiet challenge. The more Nate examined what had happened, the more he understood. The ghost was a contradiction made flesh, both savior and fugitive, both message and mystery. They were a sniper, yes, but one who had risen above the definitions of their profession. They had redefined what it meant to deliver justice, not in daylight with reports and signatures, but from the cover of invisibility, from the dark, from a place most people couldn't even conceptualize, let alone reach. And now Nate Ryland, once a man defined by his devotion to structure, discipline, and the sanctity of visible truth, was being slowly, inexorably drawn into a world that defied all three. He had built his entire career on what could be proven, what could be seen and measured. But this pursuit had begun to unmake him. The darkness that enveloped the case wasn't just metaphorical anymore. It had started seeping into him, reshaping the very foundations of how he understood right and wrong, cause and effect, action and consequence. This chase, which had started as a procedural operation, a mission to identify and apprehend a rogue sniper, had transformed into something deeply personal and far more disorienting. It was no longer simply about finding a perpetrator. It was about what this journey was doing to him. Every step deeper into the ghost's world peeled away another layer of certainty he had once taken for granted. Every unanswered question wasn't just a mystery, it was a mirror forcing him to examine the limits of his own beliefs. All he had to go on, if one could even call it that, were three things. A single bullet casing, perfectly placed and cold with purpose. A message burned into concrete like a brand left on his very soul, and an unshakable sensation, an ever-present awareness that someone unseen was out there, watching him, studying him, waiting for his next move, not to evade him, but to guide him. It didn't feel like a fugitive avoiding capture. It felt like a master observing a student's progress. This ghost wasn't just an adversary. They were something altogether different. Something more. A phantom with purpose. A teacher cloaked in silence. A figure who didn't merely operate outside the rules. They rewrote them, recoded the playbook in real time, and then dared others to keep up. And Nate, whether he had accepted it yet or not, had already begun to change under their influence. He was being tested, molded, refined with every breadcrumb left behind. What lay ahead would not be a simple unveiling of a hidden identity. It wouldn't be a triumphant arrest, a closing of a file, or the satisfaction of a solved case. No, what awaited Nate would be something far more intimate and unnerving. It would be a confrontation with the self, with everything he had believed about justice, about ethics, about the limits of human skill. The ghost had not simply made a kill shot that defied physics. They had crafted a message, a lesson, one aimed not at their target, but at him, and Nate Ryland, willing or not, was already deep into the curriculum. The city at night was a different beast, a sprawling, neon-drenched labyrinth of secrets and shadows. Its constant humming energy was a stark contrast to the desolate silence Nate Ryland carried with him. He stood on the rooftop of Clark Tower, the wind whipping at his coat, the cold, metallic weight of the bullet casing in his pocket a constant, tangible reminder of the ghost he was chasing. The text had arrived just an hour ago, a cold, anonymous command that bypassed all official channels. Rooftop. Bring the casing. Come alone. There was no sender, no number, just a digital imperative that he knew instinctively he had to obey. It was a summons, a challenge, a final test of his resolve. He was alone. He had left Rami behind, a decision that felt both necessary and deeply wrong. Rami would have argued, would have tried to reason with him, to protect him with numbers and logic. But this wasn't about logic anymore. This was a private meeting between a hunter and a ghost, a silent conversation between two people who were bound by a past they couldn't escape. It was a confrontation that had to happen, a truth that had to be revealed, and it had to happen on a stage of the ghost's choosing. Nate scanned the rooftop, his hand resting on the hilt of his concealed pistol, a professional's reflex that felt hollow and almost absurd in this context. It was a barren, windswept space with a single dark figure standing by the ledge, their back to him. The figure was a woman. Her silhouette was as still as a statue, a ghost-like presence against the backdrop of the city lights, her form a perfect contradiction to the chaos and movement of the world below. He approached slowly, his boots making no sound on the concrete. The wind, which had been a constant howling presence, seemed to quiet as he got closer, as if even the elements were holding their breath. He stopped 10 feet away, a respectful distance, a professional distance. He had a million questions, a million accusations, a million demands for an explanation, but he said nothing. He just waited. "You came," a voice said, low and calm. It was a voice that held no emotion, no fear, no regret. It was a voice that had been trained to be a weapon, a sound that was designed to be as cold and precise as a bullet. The woman turned. Her face was a paradox of youth and age, with eyes that had seen things no one should ever have to see. She was Anya Drakov. Nate recognized her from the file, a ghost-like presence that had been discharged for insubordination, a name that had been erased from the official record. Her hair, the color of a winter sky, was pulled back in a tight bun, and her features were sharp and defined, a beautiful, deadly sculpture of a face. Her gaze, when it met his, was intense and unwavering, a silent challenge that demanded his full attention. "You left a breadcrumb trail," Nate said, his voice a low growl. The accusation was not in his tone, but in the words themselves. The casing, the message, the coordinates. "You wanted me to find you." Anya simply nodded, her eyes fixed on his. "I wanted to see if you would break the rules to find the truth. I wanted to see if you were still a man who lived by your own code, or a man who had become a slave to the system." "You killed a man," Nate said, the statement hanging in the air, heavy with the weight of its own truth. "I executed a traitor," Anya corrected, her voice still calm, composed. "Victor was a parasite. He was a monster who was going to hurt innocent people to make a political statement. The system failed to stop him. The rules you follow, the chain of command, the bureaucracy, it all broke down. So I did what had to be done." Nate's mind flashed back to the day of the standoff. The little girl, her screams, her father's grief. He had been powerless. He had followed the rules, and the rules had failed him. He had watched as a life was about to be taken, and he had been unable to stop it. But Anya hadn't. She had broken them, and a life had been saved. The cognitive dissonance was a physical ache in his chest. "The shot was impossible," Nate said, his voice a whisper of disbelief. "Dr. Chun, the best in the business, ran the simulations 1 billion times. It defies every law of physics." Anya smiled, a small sad curve of her lips. It was the first sign of emotion she had shown. "Magic doesn't kill, Nate. Mathematics does. Planning does. Perfect timing does." She walked to the edge of the rooftop, her back to him, and pointed to a distant building. The shot wasn't about the distance. It was about the variables. "I had a spotter in that crane, a wind device, and a computer program that was running a live simulation of every possible trajectory. I didn't just guess the wind. I measured it. I didn't just hope for an open window. I waited for it. The shot was a puzzle I solved." Nate felt a chill run down his spine. She wasn't just a sniper, she was a tactician, a brilliant, ruthless mind that saw the world as a series of equations to be solved. She had a mastery of her craft that was beyond anything he had ever encountered. She was a living weapon, a human instrument of justice who operated on a level of intellectual and physical superiority that was terrifying to behold. "Victor was your former teammate too," Nate said, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "You were there, the day everything fell apart." Anya nodded, her eyes fixed on the city below. "I was there. I was a witness. Victor was a good man once. But the mission, it broke him. It broke all of us. And when the government swept it under the rug, when they called us loose ends, when they erased our names, Victor went dark. He became a weapon for hire, a monster who sold his soul for money. I went dark too, but I chose a different path." "And what is that path?" Nate asked, his voice low and grave. The question was not just for her, but for himself. He was looking for an answer to a question he had been asking himself for 5 years. "Justice," Anya said softly, but her voice carried a weight that cut through the night air like a blade. It wasn't loud, yet it resounded with an immovable strength. A quiet defiance forged in solitude, in all the places where bureaucracy stumbles, where rules unravel, where those in power choose to look away. That's where I work. That's the ground I claim. I don't wear a badge. I don't sign paperwork. I don't answer to politics. I'm off-grid. I'm a ghost, and I deliver justice in the spaces no one else dares to enter. She turned fully now, no longer a silhouette against the skyline, but a living truth standing just feet from Nate. Her gaze, intense, unwavering, held no apology, no hesitation, only purpose. I've lived in the margins for years, she continued, her voice sharpening with a heat that had long simmered beneath her icy composure. While others debate policy and protocol, I've been moving in silence, doing the things they won't admit need doing. There are more like me, Nate, others the system cast aside. We're the forgotten, the fractured, but we're not broken. We still believe in justice, even when the world pretends it's out of fashion. Without another word, Anya slipped her hand into her coat and produced a small folded slip of paper. It was plain, unassuming, yet unmistakably familiar. The same texture, the same faint markings, the same ghost signature as the coordinates left at the crane. A message, not for the world, but for him. She stepped forward and placed it gently into Nate's open hand, her fingers briefly brushing his. The contact was fleeting, but it was cold, metallic and chilling, just like the casing that had never left his pocket. It felt like fate. When the rules collapse again, she whispered, voice now hushed like prophecy, you'll remember tonight. You'll remember the shot you couldn't fire, the innocent life you couldn't save. And you'll remember this truth, that sometimes the only real justice comes from the shadows. The rooftop, so still just seconds ago, began to stir. The wind returned in force, wild and uncontained, swirling around them like a ghost made of air and warning. The city lights below, once steady and sharp, began to shimmer, blurred by motion or memory or something in between, and then she was gone. Anya Drakov stepped off the edge. Nate surged forward, a cry trapped in his throat, his heartbeat thunderous in his ears. But there was no scream, no sound of impact, no trace of a body, only wind, only silence. She hadn't fallen. She had disappeared, vanished like mist, like myth, like the phantom she had always been. Anya Drakov didn't die that night. She evaporated, as only a ghost can. He stared over the ledge, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. There was nothing, no trace, no sign of a body, no sound of a fall, just the cold, relentless wind and the indifferent lights of the city below. The ghost had proven that she wasn't just a sniper. She was a phantom. A living paradox who could bend the laws of physics to her will. He stood there for a long time, the folded note in his hand, a solitary figure on a windswept rooftop, a man who had just seen a ghost and was now holding a piece of her truth. He didn't call it in. He didn't radio command. He didn't report the meeting or the note or the impossible disappearance. He just stood there. A man who had lived his life in the light, now staring into the darkness. A man who was about to make a choice that would change his life forever. The city's heartbeat pulsed beneath him, a relentless rhythm of indifference and motion that had no space for ghosts. Nate Ryland stood on the rooftop of Clark Tower, the wind his only companion, the cold note in his hand his only proof. Anya Drakov, the ghost, had vanished, not fallen, not climbed, but simply ceased to be, a mirage that had dissolved into the cold night air. He leaned over the ledge, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and disbelief. He had lived his life by the cold, hard rules of physics, and a woman had just shattered them, not with magic, but with an otherworldly grace and control that defied all explanation. Below, the streetlights painted a grid of amber, and the cars moved like tiny, indifferent beetles. There was no trace of her, just the cold, unforgiving wind and the memory of a woman who had spoken of justice and shadows. He didn't call it in. The thought flickered and died before it could even form. What would he say? Command, I just met a ghost on a rooftop, and she gave me a note and then vanished into thin air. They would section him, strip him of his badge, and send him to a padded room. He was a man of logic, and he had just witnessed a miracle, a truth that was so profound, so terrifying, that it couldn't be contained in a report, in a file, in a sanitized narrative. He knew with a bone-deep certainty that this truth was his alone to carry. The days that followed were a blur of sterile official business. The command center, which had been a hotbed of confusion and panic, slowly began to sterilize the incident. The official report, a cold, dry document, was finalized and stamped. It read, in its final damning sentence, target eliminated by unknown sniper. Case closed. The words were a lie, a sanitized narrative designed to protect the system, to bury the truth under a mountain of bureaucracy. Nate knew the lie, and he now knew the truth, but he couldn't let it go. The casing in his pocket, the note in his desk drawer, the memory of Anya's eyes, it all gnawed at him, a relentless, quiet obsession. He started digging, not as an official investigator, but as a man haunted by a ghost. He used Rami's expertise, feeding him coded fragments of the casing's analysis, the message from the warehouse floor, the fleeting details of Anya's file. Rami, a man of numbers, a man of logic, was slowly, painstakingly beginning to see the patterns that Nate had already felt in his gut. The ghost's digital breadcrumbs, a series of complex mathematical equations, were a language that only a handful of people in the world could understand. Rami was one of them. He was slowly, painstakingly translating the ghost's message, a silent conversation between a ghost and a human calculator. The casing, Dr. Brooks had confirmed, had no serial, no markings, no unique imperfections. It was a perfect blank slate, a phantom bullet that could not be traced. It was an impossibility, a manufactured paradox that had no place in the physical world. Nate's mind reeled. The ghost wasn't just a sniper. She was a master of her craft, a living weapon that had transcended the limitations of the physical world. He unfolded Anya's note once more. The paper felt oddly timeless in his hand, its texture unnervingly pristine, as though it had bypassed the wear and tear of the real world entirely. It bore no creases from anxious folding, no moisture from nervous palms, no frayed edges from hasty handling. It was untouched, unaged, almost reverent in its stillness, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment in this exact rooftop wind to be opened, and perhaps, in a way, it had. Nate unfolded it slowly, his gloved fingers careful, not out of fear of damaging it, but out of respect for the woman who had left it, for what it represented. The handwriting was immaculate, not ornate, not artistic, but composed, controlled, each curve and angle precise like the mechanics of a trigger pull. The script was confident, flowing with ease and sharpness, like a mind that didn't second-guess itself. No hesitation, no emotion betrayed, just lines laid down with surgical efficiency. It looked like it had been written in a single uninterrupted breath. And the message? Some shots must be witnessed, not reported. 7 words, 7 impossibly heavy words, but they struck Nate with a force far more disorienting than any blast wave or sniper's recoil. They didn't just land, they settled deep into the hollows of his chest, where instinct wrestled with doubt, where duty tangled with conscience. He read them again, and again, and again, until they blurred, then refocused, not because his eyes were tired, but because his mind was tearing open. At first glance, they were cryptic. A sniper's code, perhaps, a vague poetic gesture. But no, each word was deliberate, calculated, chosen not for poetic rhythm, but for precision of meaning. The truth wasn't just in what they said, it was in what they didn't say, in the silence between the syllables, in the haunting finality of the period that followed. This note wasn't a confession, it wasn't an explanation, it was a revelation, a distillation of something deeper than any doctrine or field manual could teach. It was a lesson, a principle, a quiet defiance written not in blood or thunder but in ink, because sometimes ink is the deadliest form of permanence. And slowly, with the creeping gravity of inevitability, Nate understood. This moment, this truth, was never about the logistics of the shot, not about how far the bullet flew, not about the wind direction or the arc of descent, not even about Viktor Kovac or the life he threatened. It was about the act of witnessing, the burden of seeing, the irreversible transformation that happens when you stand on the edge of order and chaos and you don't blink. It wasn't about who took the shot, it was about who understood it, who could carry its weight. Because some acts, Anya was saying, don't need to be explained. They can't be reduced into reports or filed away into bureaucratic systems. They defy classification. They don't belong to ranks or jurisdictions. They belong to people. People who watch, who feel, who are changed by what they've seen. Nate realized now he had been chosen not as a witness of circumstance, but as a witness of conviction. He hadn't fired the bullet, but he had been placed in its path, not physically, but morally. He had seen what most would never see, not because he was in the right place, but because he had the right eyes. Eyes that still searched for justice in the grey, eyes that didn't flinch from uncomfortable truths. Anya had left the shot behind as an act of justice, but she had left the note behind as an act of mentorship. She hadn't just shown him a new path, she had quietly dared him to walk it. Nate folded the paper slowly, almost ritualistically, and slid it back into the inner lining of his jacket, next to the cold casing he'd carried since that night. Two relics of an event that didn't make sense to the outside world, but to him they made perfect sense now. They weren't evidence of a mystery, they were instructions for a transformation. He wasn't just carrying a secret, he was carrying a standard, a silent vow. Because some truths, some justice, don't announce themselves with badges or headlines. They arrive in silence. They land in impossible arcs, and they wait patiently for someone like Nate to see them for what they are. He was no longer a man hunting a ghost. He was becoming what the ghost had always been, a sentinel of the in-between, a custodian of impossible decisions, a witness to the moments the world would never understand because it was too afraid to see. He wasn't the same man who had stood on that rooftop. That man had believed in categories, right and wrong, shooter and target, chain of command and mission completion, but that binary world had shattered the moment a ghost's bullet carved a path through impossibility. Now, Nate lived in the aftermath, a place of nuance, of shadows, of seeing and never being able to unsee. He was no longer just a sniper, not in the way the Bureau trained them, not in the way his service file defined him. That identity had burned away with the muzzle flash no one saw. What remained was something quieter, more burdened. He had not pulled the trigger, but he had been transformed by the shot nonetheless. He was the witness, and witnessing, he now realized, was its own responsibility. He understood now why Anya had left the casing behind, why she had etched those words into concrete, why she had shown herself, not to the world but to him. The bullet had not been meant only for Viktor Kovac. It had been aimed in a deeper way at Nate Ryland. It had forced him to confront everything he had believed about justice, authority, and violence, because the casing wasn't just evidence, it was a lesson. A final, silent instruction from a teacher who operated where systems failed, a token to remind him that not all justice wears a badge, that not all protection comes from procedure, that sometimes the most righteous acts are the ones done without permission, in silence, in the dark. And now, Nate carried that silence inside him. He looked out at the city, lights flickering like signals from another language he was only just beginning to understand. The wind tugged at his coat, whispering with that same phantom voice that had haunted him ever since the shot rang out. He folded the note again with reverent care and slipped it inside the inner pocket of his jacket, right next to the casing. Side by side, two impossible artifacts, two anchors to a truth no one else would ever believe. There would be other operations, other crises, other times when the rules failed. And when that time came, Nate knew. He wouldn't reach for the radio. He would remember the rooftop, the eyes that didn't blink, the bullet that came from nowhere, and he would remember that some justice demands a witness. And next time, if no one else could make the call, it just might be his turn to vanish into the shadows. And so we are left with the silence. The official report, a cold, dry document, gathers dust in a forgotten file cabinet. The world has moved on, content with the sterilized narrative of a hero shot, an impossible miracle that saved a little girl's life. But Nate Ryland, and now you, the audience of Veteranbiker, know the truth. We have seen the ghost. We have held the weight of an untraceable casing, and we have read the words left in the shadows. The story of the woman who thought she was just posing with a sniper rifle is not just a tale of a heroic shot. It is a profound and unsettling meditation on the nature of justice itself. It forces us to ask the most difficult questions. When the system fails, when the rules break down, and when the official channels are choked by bureaucracy and lies, what then? Do we stand by and watch as injustice unfolds, or do we become the very thing we fear? Anya Drakov is a paradox. She is a criminal who broke every law, a phantom who operated outside the lines, a ghost who delivered a brutal, final justice. But in doing so, she became a hero. She became the answer to a question no one else could solve. She became the protector of the innocent, the avenger of the betrayed. She chose a path of darkness, but she did so to bring light to a world that was being consumed by shadows. And what of Nate Ryland? He is a man who was defined by his rules, his code, his belief in the system. But in a single, impossible moment, his entire world was shattered. He was a witness to a truth that was too big, too terrifying, too profound for him to comprehend. He was given a choice: to forget the ghost, to bury the truth, and to go back to a life of sterile official narratives, or to embrace the shadows and become a part of the world that Anya Drakov inhabits. The note she left him, the final prophetic message, "Some shots must be witnessed, not reported," is not just a single line of text. It is a philosophy, a creed, a way of life. It is a declaration that some truths are not meant for the official record, not meant for the public eye, not meant for the sanitized pages of history. Some truths are meant to be felt, to be experienced, to be lived. They are meant for the men and women who have been broken by the system, for the ones who have been forgotten, for the ones who still believe in justice, even when the world has moved on. The bullet casing, a perfect blank slate with no serial number, no markings, no history, is a symbol of that truth. It is a testament to a ghost who was so good at her craft that she transcended the very limitations of the physical world. She was a sniper who could not be traced, a bullet that could not be reported, a ghost that could not be caught. She was a living paradox, a force of nature, a legend in the making. We as a community, as fellow riders on the long, winding road of life, are now a part of this story. We have seen the ghost, and we have been given a choice. Do we believe in the sanitized narrative, or do we believe in the truth? Do we believe in the rules, or do we believe in the justice that comes from the shadows? The road ahead is long and uncertain. There are shadows on every corner, ghosts in every forgotten alleyway, and injustices waiting to be righted. We, as a community of veteran bikers, are not just a group of riders. We are a family, a brotherhood, and a sisterhood of people who believe in a higher truth, a deeper sense of justice. We are the ones who are willing to ride into the darkness, to face the ghosts, to seek the truth, no matter how terrifying it may be. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. This story, and every story we tell on this channel, is a testament to the power of truth, the power of a single impossible shot, and the power of a ghost who chose to deliver justice when no one else could. If you enjoyed this story, and if you believe in the power of the shadows, then please give this video a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the Veteran Biker channel for more tales from the road. And as always, let us know in the comments below what you thought of this story. We want to hear your thoughts, your theories, your feelings about the impossible shot. We are a community, and your voice matters. Thank you again for watching. And remember, the road ahead is long, the shadows are deep, and the truth is out there, waiting to be found. Ride safe and ride free.